Okay, our next lesson is going to be about this something called the spending multiplier. Now, the spending multiplier has very much to do with fiscal policy, which of course is the theme of this entire unit. In our last unit, we learned that fiscal policy was anything, or our last lesson, I should say, was anything that the government does to influence the economy. Well, I'd like you to recall two things to start off with. First, you might remember a few modules ago we learned about something called the money multiplier. And that helped us determine how much M1 could be created by a new deposit in a bank. I only mention that for this module because what we're going to be learning about in this lesson is very similar. In fact, the title of our lesson is called the spending multiplier, but it actually is very similar in principle that when the government does something, its effect is not only the effect we see right away, but the effect can be drawn out over a period of time, just the way the money multiplier told us that Federal Reserve policy could do the same thing. I also want to remind us about this thing called the crowding out effect. We learned about that in our last lesson, and that was the idea that when the government expands the economy, it tends to push up interest rates, and that pushes private consumers and investors out of the market. And you might remember that because of that, the impact of fiscal policy was actually brought back a little bit. Well, today's lesson is actually going to show us that, in fact, despite the fact that the crowding out effect may exist, the spending multiplier actually means that fiscal policy is even more powerful than we initially notice. And in fact, it actually is the opposite of the crowding out effect. We'll take a look at that idea. I want to start with the spending multiplier and first ask a simple question. Why do we use it? Well, here I want to start with an example to explain this. Suppose the government spends $1,000 on a new set of office furniture. How much did our GDP increase? Well, the answer, I suppose, obviously is $1,000, assuming that office furniture was new office furniture. Now suppose, however, that furniture maker saves $100 from that 1,000, but spends $900 on a new lawn tractor. How much our GDP was created? Answer, $900. Remember, anything that's spent on new consumption, in this case a tractor, counts as our GDP. Now suppose the lawn tractor store owner spends $810 of that 900 on new equipment for the store and saves 90. How much our GDP was created? It looks like another $810. Well, what do we notice is happening? Every time this money changes hands, it looks like more RGDP is being created. One last time. So how much did RGDP was created altogether because of the original $100,000 in government spending? Well, 1,000 from the original spending, then 900 from the furniture maker, then 810 from the lawn tractor owner, so we ended up with $2,710. In other words, the initial $1,000 spent by the government actually created a great deal more than that in spending on our GDP. Does this sound familiar? Well, that's why I mentioned the money multiplier earlier. Very, very similar. Here's the difference. The spending multiplier measures how much government policy impacts the economy as opposed to how much the Federal Reserve policy influences the economy, but they work very similarly. Now, if you think back to our money multiplier, what was it that determined how large the money multiplier was? Well, the multiplier was determined by the thing that would actually stop the money from growing as fast as possible. And what was that with the money multiplier? Well, it was the reserve requirement. Remember, the reserve requirement said that banks had to keep a certain amount of money in the bank, and therefore that money couldn't go from person to bank, from person to bank, from person to bank, and grow. Well, what is the thing that determines how much money, how large the spending multiplier will be? Well, if you think back to our example, one of the things I mentioned was how much money people were saving. The key idea is that in order for the money to grow, the spending to grow, it has to go from person to person. So what's the one thing that stops money from moving from person to person? It's savings. So we're going to have to consider savings as we move along. Okay, so we need some new terms to help us understand how this is going to work. Our first term, which is actually not a new one, it's one we've used before, but I want to mention it again, is called disposable income. And that is money that is not allocated to required expenses. So essentially, it's additional money that people can choose what they want to do with it. Okay, our next definition is something called the marginal propensity to consume, or we'll put in parentheses the MPC. The MPC is the percentage of disposable income that is actually spent. So if for some reason someone receives an extra $100, and they spend 90% of it, or $90, then the MPC is 90%. Of course, the opposite would be the marginal propensity to save. And that is the percentage of disposable income that is saved. So like in our example, if someone received $100 and the MPC was 90, the MPS would probably be 10%, add up to 100. These two things always will add up to 100%. You only have two options with what to do with money: either consume with it or spend with it, equaling 100%. So if those two things in your mind don't add up to 100%, then you may have made a mistake in your problem. So how does the spending multiplier actually work? Well, here's the formula first. The spending multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the MPS. Now that shouldn't be a surprise. The money multiplier was 1 divided by the reserve requirement. And the reserve requirement was the thing that was holding back the multiplier. Well, in the spending multiplier, which again we'll represent with an M, it's the savings that's holding back. So 1 over the MPS, the marginal propensity to save, is our formula. But by the way, it can also be represented as 1 over the M1 minus the MPC, because remember, the MPC plus the MPS always adds up to 1. So whichever formula is more convenient, both will work. Let's do an example. If a country's average MPC is 80%, what's the nation's spending multiplier? And this is very similar again to calculating the money multiplier. The answer is M has to equal 1 over 1 minus the MPC, which is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8, which is equal to 1 divided by 0.2, which is equal to 5. And again, these may have been memorized in our last unit. If you have a little trouble with fractions, you may want to do that. So the MPC at 80% creates a multiplier of 5. Now let's try it. Try to find the multiplier of a country whose MPS is 25%. Stop the recording, try the problem, and then keep going. Okay, our MPS is 25%. So how much is our multiplier? Well, remember the formula is either 1 over the 1 minus the MPC, like in our last question, or 1 over the MPS. Here is our 1 over the MPS right here. So that equals 1 over 0.25, which is equal to 4. So in this case, our multiplier is 4. All right, now that we know how to calculate a multiplier, we probably want to know how to use it. So here's how we do so. If we want to know how much our GDP is going to grow, we simply calculate the amount of government spending times the multiplier. So for example, if country X has an MPC of 90% and the government of country X spends 10 million on a new fighter jet, how much our GDP could be created? Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to find our multiplier. We found that our MPC is 90%, so the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus 0.9, which is equal to 1 over 0.1, which is equal to 10. We then note that we have to multiply the amount of government spending times that multiplier. So in this case, it's 10 million times 10, which is equal to 100 million. Let's try another example. If country Y has an MPS of 5%, how much could $200 in government spending create in our GDP? Again, we need to calculate the multiplier. First, the multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 0.05, which is equal in this case to 20. Now that we know our multiplier, we can use it in order to calculate the potential growth in our GDP. And that is equal to, again, the government spending times the multiplier, which is going to be equal to $200 times 20, which is equal to 4,000. The point is that generally speaking, money spent by the government tends to not only grow by the amount spent by the government, but it tends to grow by quite a bit more because that money is now in the economy and being spent by other people. Let's have you try an example. If the government of Macroacondia has an MPC of 75% and its government spends $500, how much GDP could be created? Stop the video here and try your response. Okay, let's see how you did. The first thing we need to do is calculate the multiplier. The multiplier is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, which is equal to 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, which I'm over here now is equal to 1 divided by 0.25, which is equal to 4. So our multiplier is 4. So if we had $500 spent, our growth in our GDP is the government spending of $500 times the multiplier of 4, which gives us a potential growth in our GDP of $2,000. Okay, now how are things different with tax cuts than they are with government spending? So far, all of our examples have been with government spending. Well, suppose instead the government cuts taxes as its choice of fiscal policy. We want to know how are things different, and they are a little bit different with tax cuts than they are with government spending. Let's do an example again to illustrate why things are different. Suppose the government implements a fiscal policy that costs $100. Either way, whether it's a tax cut or government spending, we're going to say it's $100. I want to show a chart to explain why these two scenarios end up with different results. Here's our little chart. Now, again, we've spent $100. And in both illustrations here, we're going to assume that we have an MPC of 80%. Let's start with the situation we're familiar with, the one on the right. The government buys a desk. The government spends $100. Very straightforward in this first round right here. The government then takes that money and spends it to a desk maker, who then spends 80% of that money, and now we have $180. And then that desk maker goes and buys something else. I think we used in our example buying something for his shop. He spends $64, and that money is now here. And in those 3 cycles of spending, we've all created $244. This is what we're familiar with. Let's suppose that instead we go back over here, and instead of giving the desk maker spending of $100, we just cut his taxes by $100. Well, here's the change in that. The difference here is that when you cut his taxes by $80, remember that in this case the MPC kicks in right away. So in our example over here, the government spent the $100 and all $100 went into moving through the economy. But in this case, by cutting his taxes by $80, the desk maker, we only actually get $80 to go into, by cutting his taxes by $100, we only get into the economy $80 because what does the desk maker do? He saves 20% of it. So right away, our initial number is only going to be 80 getting into the spending circle as opposed to 100 over here. And you can see that now step by step, that's going to mean less spending in every cycle, to the point that after 3 rounds, we've only created $195 as opposed to $244. So it appears that tax cuts tend to be somewhat less powerful than government spending. Let's do an example here to see how this would all work out. Okay, so first our formula. If we're going to use tax cuts and see how much GDP tax cuts can create, we need a new formula. And that's going to be the tax cut itself times the MPC times the multiplier. Now, this MPC here in the center was not here when we were talking about government spending. Why? Because we assume the MPC with government spending is always 100. The government's always going to spend 100% of what it wants to spend. That's not true with a tax cut, because the consumer is going to keep a portion of that money. So, for example, this is this same example we did a few slides ago, but instead of using government spending, we're going to use a tax cut. If the country of Macroacondia cuts income taxes by $500 and the nation has an MPC of 75%, how much RGDP could be created? Well, first we find our multiplier just like in our last example, and it was 4. However, we now take a new formula, the tax cut times the MPC, which we then multiply times, and that gives us $500, the amount of the tax cut, times zero point 0.8, and then times 4. Zero point 0.8 being the MPC, which means now we have 400 times 4, which means the total possible GDP growth is $1,600. Now, if you think back to our previous problem, when we did government spending instead, that $500 turned into $2,000. So there's no doubt that government spending generally is more powerful to the economy, or increases in government spending are generally more powerful than our tax cuts because usually a portion of that money is saved. Okay, so let's summarize this whole thing. First, assuming the MPC is not 100%, or in other words, assuming that some money is saved, not everything is spent. Government spending increases result in more RGDP than an equally sized tax cut. Why? Because a portion of a tax cut is saved but not spent. And by the way, that is a favorite question of the AP exam. They'll say something to the effect of, if there was $100 in government spending and $100 in tax cuts, which one would likely result in more RGDP? And again, the answer would be government spending, and the reason is because with a tax cut, a portion of the tax cut is saved and not spent. That concludes this lesson.